Okay, so we talked about the visual artifact or written text that's the artifact, whatever it is, how to put it into a visual organizer. Now what we want to do is think about how do we translate this into a paragraph. Well, to start, we're in a good place because we really have already written our claim. And our claim is going to be the first sentence of our body paragraph. So just to show you what that's going to look like, I'm going to take that language from the visual organizer and turn it into this claim. Before and after pictures of Native Americans at the Carlisle School, notice I provide the date, demonstrate how assimilation at Indian schools reinforced ideas of racial hierarchy and over ideals of racial equality. Now notice that I have put the language of the tension in bold here, but it's not actually going to be in bold in your paper. I've also put it in blue here so that you can see later how the claim is different from the rest of the paragraph. But when you actually create your paragraph, when you draft it, I am going to have you use these same color codes, but ultimately when you turn it into a paper, you're going to turn everything into regular black text. But anyway, there's a claim. And I think you know how to do this. We've done this several times now. Street art projects, oral midterm. Now, how do we take the details and interpretation that we've identified in our visual organizer, again, going back up here, how do we take those and start writing sentences? Well, again, let me scroll down and show you some color coding that I've done as a way of showing you how you might do that. So you have your claim, and now you want to start looking at specific details from the artifact. In this case, I want to talk first about their hairstyles and their haircuts. And you'll notice that my discussion of their haircuts appears in orange. And in brown, I have, or dark red, I have an interpretation of the relationship between those styles and what I said in the claim. So the claim says the artifact reinforces racial hierarchy over racial equality. I then have my detail, the hairstyles. I then have my language that interprets that detail by explaining how they're a mark of assimilation. So when you draft your sentences, you want to do the same thing. You want to, in your sentence, present detail, and you want to make sure that in your sentence you interpret those details. So you're going to color code your draft paragraphs too to make sure those pieces are there. Where's the place where I describe the detail? Orange. Where's the place where I interpret the detail? Brown. Now, for this first detail, I've combined the identification of the detail and the interpretation of the detail into the same sentence. You don't have to do it that way. You could use two sentences to do this. Let's take a look at how we might do that in a two-sentence model. Again, same claim. Again, we've got the original discussion of hair and the interpretation that's part of the same sentence. But I now am adding a second detail to my paragraph. This time I want to talk about the clothing. Now you'll notice in this detail and interpretation pair, the detail gets its own sentence in orange, and the interpretation also gets a separate sentence. So that's another way to do this. There's not necessarily just one way to pair details and interpretation. There are multiple ways, and here's some examples that you can look at and study as you're working on your own paper. So what does that look like? Well, here we go. We've got the claim. We've got a first detail followed by an interpretation of that detail in brown. Then we have a second detail, again in orange, and an interpretation of that detail in brown, but in a separate sentence. So that's two approaches. Now, you might be able to stop at two details, but really it's a good idea to shoot for at least three details that you want to unpack. Now, it might be that your two details you have so much to say about it's already a huge paragraph, but in general, a third detail is a good goal. You're not limited to that. It's not a strict rule. It's just a good way to think about it. So let's look at the same paragraph again, but add a third detail. So we start off with the claim sentence. We have the first detail pairing, clothing with its interpretation. We have the second detail pairing, in this case, the first one was hair. In this case, clothing with its interpretation. The interpretation's in a separate sentence, as opposed to the first one where the interpretation comes in the same sentence as the detail. Finally, though, we look at a third detail that we've added into this paragraph. This one's a little shorter, more concise, but you'll notice that this one is a sentence that mixes detail with interpretation of detail integrated into the same sentence. So here's yet a third way. First way was beginning of the sentence, detail, end of the sentence, interpretation. Second way was one sentence detail, second sentence interpretation. A third way is to mix together interpretation and detailed description into a freely flowing sentence. All three of these approaches are great. No one is better than the other. They all work well. You can use all or one of them, whatever works for you, to pound out these body paragraphs. Now, remember, I have not been reading these sentences to you. Reading them would pay off, but I didn't want to make this video too long. So I would encourage you to frequently stop and pause this video as you rewatch it, because I think this is a really important video to watch a second time. Because in this video, what have we done? We have moved from a visual artifact, or you could have been a written text, to a visual organizer, to a paragraph claim, to a paragraph that supports that claim with one detail and interpretation, to a paragraph that supports that claim with two details and interpretation set up in different ways, to a paragraph that fully supports this claim with three detailed images and interpretations. That's a big paragraph. Well, it looks really big because right now it's in a crazy big Arial font, but if you cut it back down to kind of a more respectable size, you can see that that's not a crazy big paragraph. But seeing it visually like this helps you see the ebb and flow. Blue is the claim. Orange are the details, the description of the details of the text. Quotes, images, whatever you're pulling from the artifact. Then comes in the brown or the red here, the interpretations of those details. So it's always detail, interpretation, detail, interpretation, detail, interpretation. We always want to avoid detail, 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 interpretation, because then we make the mistake of including details we don't fully explain. For every single detail, we offer an interpretation. That's the ticket to a really nicely developed paragraph for this paper. Okay, so ends video lecture number 2. I'd like you to move on to video lecture number 3, where I'm going to show you how to bring in a cultural context and how to use the works cited to do that. All right, see you in video 3.